So today I'm going to make 1 loaf of sourdough sandwich bread with this starter, which is active and bubbly, that I fed about 12 hours ago. And I'm going to make the same loaf of bread using this inactive starter, which was fed about a week ago. You can find the recipe for this sourdough sandwich bread on my blog or on YouTube. I'll leave those links in the description box below, but I will spare you the full tutorial because I have shown that on YouTube and my blog more than one time, so you can check those out. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to say that this is a true scientific experiment, but I am trying to keep the conditions as close to identical as possible. Both of these starters were fed with half whole wheat and half all-purpose. The only difference is this one was fed last night and this one has not been fed for a week. Additionally, both of these starters are the same temperatures. I've had them out at room temperature, and that is important to note because the temperature determines how fast your starter activates. So if one was colder than the other, that would change the fermentation process or the bulk fermentation when we make bread. So these are both the same temperature. So whether or not this is a true scientific experiment, which it is not, this is at least enough for you to decide if it's worth your time to use inactive starter for baking. Okay, so I'm gonna get these 2 batches of dough going. I put both bowls of dough in the proofing box set to 81 degrees, so that way I know they're bulk fermenting at the same temperature. Now, I predict a couple of things based upon my experiences. However, I'm not totally sure because I've never done a side-by-side comparison. But one, I predict that the dough made with the active sourdough starter will bulk ferment and double faster because when starter is active and bubbly, it has more bacteria and yeast. When it's inactive, it needs to be fed. So I think that the active dough will work a little bit faster, but I also think the inactive dough will work just fine. When you're baking sourdough, what you're really doing is you're feeding your starter. So normally when you feed your starter, you would give it 1 part starter, 1 part flour, and 1 part water. But when you bake, you're giving it a part starter and then a big part flour and a big part of water. So you're actually feeding your starter. So baking, in theory, with inactive starter should work just fine. It might just take a little bit longer for all the bacteria and yeast to metabolize the flour and let it bulk ferment. The other thing I predict is that there might be a little bit of difference in flavor, and that is because time and temperature are what determines the flavor of sourdough. So if the active sourdough starter bulk ferments faster, my theory is it will taste a little bit different than the one that bulk ferments slower. But first we have to find out if they actually bulk ferment at a different pace. So we'll check back in a number of hours. I had to switch to voiceover because my toddler came home from preschool, but this is about 6 hours later, and you can see the active starter on the left, that dough is already doubled in size. It's beginning to dome on top, but the inactive still has a long way to go. So at this point, I am preparing the active dough for shaping. So I'm just taking it out of the bowl, getting it into a baking dish, and then I'll put it back into the proofing box for a second rise. But one thing I do want to note is that because this is sandwich bread, it is an enriched dough, meaning that it has butter and other ingredients in it. Those types of doughs, enriched doughs, take longer to ferment no matter what. So even though the active is already working faster, both of these are going to be a pretty long bulk fermentation and a pretty long second rise. I let the dough with the active starter do a second rise for about 2 hours, then it baked for 45 minutes, and then it cooled all the way to room temperature. And the dough with the inactive starter by that point had still not doubled in size. It's about 8:30 p.m. I think this probably needs at least another hour for its second proof. Then I have to bake it and wait for it to cool, and this mama really needs to get some sleep at this point. So I'm gonna put this in the fridge and bake it tomorrow. That means the taste test experiment will not work because when you put sourdough in the fridge to cold proof, that develops more sour flavor. If you remember the beginning of the video, I mentioned that temperature and time determine the flavor of your bread. Cold temperatures make your bread more sour, so it wouldn't really be a fair comparison. However, there are 2 things that are for sure. 1, the active sourdough starter worked faster, but 2, the inactive sourdough starter is working. It's just slow. Both loaves of bread are done. So the bread with the active sourdough starter is beautiful, and the bread with the inactive sourdough starter is beautiful. They both turned out perfectly fine. This one, the inactive starter was a lot faster, but both of these worked like a charm. So whether or not you use active or inactive starter for your bread really depends on how much time you have and how much time you want to spend. So if you know that you want to bake on a certain day, it's probably a good idea to feed your sourdough starter the night before and then bake the next day, because that, at least in this case, is the fastest way. However, if you find that just on a whim you want to bake something or you forgot to feed your sourdough starter, you can definitely make your dough. You will just need more time to let it bulk ferment, and in this case, do a second rise. So one maybe isn't better than the other, but one is definitely faster than the other. The good news is, whether you use active starter or inactive, the only thing you really need is a little bit of time.